We're ready.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone to this UK and a Changing Europe session looking at the future of parliamentary treaty scrutiny. And it's an excellent time to be looking at this subject because we know that one of the benefits of Brexit is that the UK government wants to strike new trade deals right across the globe. But we also know that the two most important trade deals that the UK has done, the withdrawal agreement and the trade and cooperation agreement with the EU, got remarkably little scrutiny, especially the trade and cooperation agreement. I think it's quite striking that Lord Frost was giving evidence this morning to the PACAC committee, the Public Administration and Parliamentary Affairs Committee, and I think he was admitting that there was insufficient scrutiny of the various treaties, and actually he made some quite positive suggestions about what more could be done. In the light of that, the exchange of letters between one of our speakers today, Baroness Hayter, and Lord Grimstone is, I think, a very positive step about what more can be done to try to get treaties looked at. And so what I'm looking forward to hearing today is from those who've been involved, both on the inside and those on the outside, to get an understanding of what has been agreed, why it's been agreed, whether it's going to work, and what more could be done. And so I'm delighted to introduce to you our fantastic panel of speakers. Diane Hayter, Baroness Hayter of Kentish Town, Chair of the International Agreements Committee, Lord Andrew Lansley, former Secretary of State for Health, the Conservative Party, also on the committee, Alexander Horne, who was Special Advisor for the International Agreements Committee and is now Counsel at Hackett and Dabbs, and Meg Russell, Professor of Constitutional Matters at UCL and Senior Fellow at the UK in a Changing Europe. Each one is going to speak for between 5 and 7 minutes in the following order. Alex Horne will go first, followed by Andrew Lansley, then Diane Hayter, then Meg Russell. And I encourage you to ask questions via Slido and upvote on questions you particularly would like answered. And I, as chair, will try to moderate those questions and ask those questions to the panel after they've given their presentations. So once again, a huge thanks to our speakers for giving up their lunchtime to discuss this. Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you very much to UK and a Changing Europe for hosting this event, which seems very timely. I'm going to use my 5 minutes to sort of set out the background and history about treaty scrutiny, and then Diane Hayter and Andrew Lansley, I think, will speak about matters sort of looking forward a bit. Looking back in history, Parliament has been pretty bad at scrutinising treaties. I often start talks of this sort with a quote from Walter Bagehot's The English Constitution. I'm not going to read it out today, but essentially even back as far as 1872, it was noted that unlike the scrutiny of legislation, Parliament paid very little attention to treaties. And when we talk about free trade agreements, it's worth noting that free trade agreements are simply a form of treaty, and we can treat them to some extent indistinguishably from that. So from 1872, where do we go? Well, in 1924, we had the Ponsonby Rule. The Ponsonby Rule is a rule about an obligation on the government to lay treaties before Parliament. And that's pretty much it until Gordon Brown's Labour administration took another look at this in 2008-9. And the Ponsonby Rule, or at least part of it, was put on a statutory footing in 2010 under something known as the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, or CRAG to its fans. Now, CRAG made the requirement to lay treaties for 21 days a statutory one, but it gave very few powers to Parliament and almost none whatsoever to parliamentary committees. The sole real power that Parliament has, and it really is retained by the House of Commons, is to essentially delay the ratification of international agreements. There's no veto, and that's quite important because it means that Parliament has little purchase on what goes into an agreement or whether or not that agreement is eventually ratified. In terms of scrutiny, as I said, select committees took very little interest. The first recorded systematic scrutiny that we can find started in about 2013-14 with the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee, which would, as a matter of course, put in its regular reports some commentary on international agreements that were laid before the House. But there was really very little analysis going on. So what changed? Well, essentially Brexit. About 2017, I remember going into a meeting at the Foreign Office with another senior Lords official, and the context was that the FT had recorded that there were going to be 750 international agreements that would have to be scrutinised by Parliament, and that somebody was going to have to do this work. And the European Union Committee in the House of Lords was volunteered to do it on the basis that the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee was going to face a tsunami of Brexit-related SIs, and it became apparent that they were not going to be equipped to look at the treaties too. And it came to the EU committee because most of these agreements were rollover trade agreements that the EU had signed with other third countries and the UK wished to continue to participate in after Brexit. So we started off in a very collaborative way with government. To give you some idea of the context, there were weekly meetings with officials from Department for International Trade, from the Foreign Office, and from DEXEU. It was a very positive sort of engagement from the government. And after the conclusion of that programme, that exercise essentially led to the creation of the International Agreements Committee. At the same time as all of this was going on, the Lords Constitution Committee published a report on Parliament and Treaty Scrutiny. The European Union Committee published a report called Lessons Learned, reflecting on the scrutiny of all of those rollover agreements. And the International Agreements Committee, since it's been set up, has published 2 reports on working practices. And in the background, we had the trade bill rumbling through Parliament, which I believe Lord Lansley will talk about later. So I'm going to flag 2 changes. The first happened during the passage of the trade bill, and we referred to it as the Grimstone Rule. And the Grimstone Rule was an assurance given by Lord Grimstone, Jerry Grimstone, on 2 fronts in relation to the scrutiny of trade agreements, and essentially made clear that Parliament would have a role both when these agreements were being agreed and also at the final stage in the process where we would get a reasonable time to report on them and also have the opportunity for debates. And that, I think, was the first commitment that the government had given towards the idea of Parliament conducting systematic scrutiny. But there was some degree of havering about this and a back and forth with departments, and a certain lack of clarity as to what was being covered. So in the second working practices report, the International Agreements Committee proposed a memorandum of understanding between the select committees with an interest in treaties and the government, which would set out a formal framework for scrutiny. The government didn't really like this idea and spent several months trying to resist it. And the compromise that was eventually reached after a number of other Lords committees wrote to the government expressing their support for this memorandum of understanding was that there would be an exchange of letters setting all of this out, and that these letters would be placed in the House of Commons library. So essentially much the same thing, just with a different name. The exchange of letters is important because it's the first formal framework agreement between Parliament and the government about how treaties should be scrutinised. Should stress it only relates to trade agreements. It doesn't cover other treaties. I think that this will be discussed further later. But it does at least formalise that the government will provide Parliament with information about the negotiations before mandates are set, and during negotiations, that it will provide Parliament with a time to report on new trade agreements before they are laid before Parliament. And there's a commitment also to debates, subject to the availability of parliamentary time. This sounds evasive, but in practice, we found that the International Agreements Committee that we've not found the government has resisted holding a debate where they've been asked. My final comment, since I realise we're short on time, is just that these innovations have all been led from the House of Lords. There are pros and cons about this. On the pros side, you get the expertise of the members of the House of Lords. I think it's a less political environment, which has meant that the members and Jerry Grimstone were able to develop a good relationship, a constructive relationship, which has enabled this to happen. But on the downside, you have less leverage with government, and the process under the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act only gives the House of Commons the power to delay the ratification of treaties. So there's obviously a lot more work to be done there, both in the Commons and elsewhere, in working out how to make these processes work rather better. But I think I should leave things there and hand over to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that very concise but insightful presentation of the background. Andrew Lansley, Lord Lansley, the floor is yours, although I wonder if you've just come off the screen. Lord Lansley, are you there? He was having some technical difficulties earlier. I hope we can get him back. Baroness Hayter, might you step into the breach, and I hope we can get Lord Lansley back.
I've more or less lost my voice, so I was having a quick lozenge while he was going to speak, so I'll put the lozenge to one side. Thank you for that, and really following on. There's a slight jump now because Andrew will fill in a bit when we get him back. One of the main issues looking forward is in any scrutiny, one really wants to measure the impact or the success, if you like, of an FTA or any agreement, as opposed to what was set for it. What are the objectives? And there's the real hole at the moment is not having a policy framework against which it is possible to look at a particular outcome and say, does this actually keep to the policy objectives? And actually, reading through a lot of government documents, there's actually quite a lot of policy there. They do talk about wanting to have this fitting in with the environment or with other objectives, but it is not brought together into a policy document. And I think for us trying to do scrutiny on behalf of not just the Lords, but Parliament as well, you know, what are we measuring it against? So one of the major asks we have of the government is to set out a framework. Now, we've seen it in America happen. Under Biden, there is a very clear document, which in their case, they talk about a worker-centered trade policy. We would, I'm sure, want to have a trade policy that is environmentally friendly, that does meet our other both security and, if you like, diplomatic objectives, that does is an inclusive trade policy, which is fair both between countries, as far as distribution goes, between countries and within countries, and is aligned with our other desires for international relations, be it human rights or anything else. So I think that one of our major asks will be that we need a framework against which we can then measure. Once one's got that, of course, the other objective, the other real essential for us is to be able to look at the negotiating objectives for each specific set of talks. And I think that actually will go beyond just treaties, which is what we're mostly talking about. But even, you know, we're now talking about a memorandum of understanding with individual states within America, like Indiana, which obviously couldn't be a treaty because it doesn't have treaty-making abilities. But this could be quite important for trade. But again, we need to know, well, what was the objective? How can we measure the outcome of any talks if we don't know what it was trying to achieve? So it'll be quite important for our committee to have an early insight, an early input into negotiating objectives. third point I just want to touch on is not just in us having a relationship with, for example, an American state, but our committee is called the International Agreements Committee, not the International Treaty Committee, and it therefore can deal with all agreements, and that could be a memorandum of understanding, which could, because it's not legally binding, be short of a treaty, but might nevertheless have enormous implications for us in one way or another. And I think that is one of the things that we will also, we're already, I should say, in some hot dispute with the government over whether they have any obligation to even report, let alone discuss memorandum of understandings that they're discussing with other governments. Three other issues I just want to touch on. These are in a way not all related to each other, but to put onto the agenda. One is the way we work at the moment, and it's been mentioned we've got 21 days to look at these agreements, although for the big ones we have been given longer. But it is really quite problematic for us. We don't have the resource to go out commissioning research. We can't go out and check for ourselves any points about these treaties that have been signed. Where in a way our evidence gathering, we're just recipients of other people's views, which will of course be party pre, if you like. I mean, quite rightly, either consumers will come to us, or farmers will come to us, or the whiskey industry, or whoever it is, will come and give their views to us, but they're all a bit party pre. We neither have the time nor the resources at the moment to do any of our independent research on agreements, and that leaves us really quite weak in being able to do a thorough job on it. A different issue, but a really important one, is the involvement of the devolved nations. Treaties is obviously a reserved ability. Only the UK government can sign treaties, but many of these will have incredible implications on areas of devolved competencies. And I don't think we've quite yet got a situation where the devolves are sufficiently involved and party to the government's discussions. Now that it will be in a way for them to have a punch up between the devolved nations and the government over that. But as far as our scrutiny goes, I think we need to look about how the legislatures in those devolves are doing their work and how we can share with them. Two other things. Clearly, as has been touched on already, CRAG is very much a post hoc system. A treaty will come to us in 21 days to say whether we like it or not, but there's no ability either to amend that or indeed to reject it. Although, as Alex has said, the House of Commons can delay it. Now, it seems to me very important that if we were more involved throughout the stages of negotiations, then it should be by the time it gets to Parliament, and we know that Parliament will accept it. And that's much more the model that was done when the EU was doing treaties for us, is that the European Parliament would have been involved all the way through, so that by the time it finally got there, it knew whether the relevant committee would be recommending its approval and Parliament would agree it. My final point, which I think I just get in under my 5 minutes, is, as I've touched on before, our committee is the International Agreements Committee. It goes not just beyond treaties into memorandums of understanding, but it does go, as Alex said, beyond trade. And the particular one that we've got called for evidence at the moment is where a deal was done, was a memorandum of understanding, but it was done with Rwanda about the handling of asylum seekers. But because that was an MOU, it didn't have to come, it didn't even have to be shown to Parliament. although indeed it was shown, but with no ability to discuss it or go through any scrutiny. So there is an issue both about things less than treaty, but also we need to be aware that where it is a treaty from another department, and that could be the transport department about cabotage or lorry weights or all sorts of things, our committee will also deal with those sort of treaties that come not under just international trade, but under other departments. Chair, I think I've gone over my time. Apologies.
No, thank you. That was absolutely fascinating and really very helpful. And I think your last point is particularly relevant, given the focus on trade. And of course, trade is not all that treaties cover. So thank you for that. Lord Lansley, I think you're back with us, which is
Hello,
great.
Catherine. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can't see you, but I think that's probably better to keep so we can hear you.
The signal dropped out, so apologies for that. And I dropped out of the webinar, so I missed a little of what Alex was saying and Diane's beginning. So I'm back in. So I've left the video off, so you can at least hopefully hear me. And I'll just add a few, I think, additional remarks. I'll try not to repeat what you've already heard. I did want to just revert back to the trade bill, because, of course, a lot of this does relate to the assumption of responsibilities post-Brexit for trade relations with other countries. I think it's quite important for people to have in mind that things like tariff schedules, things like the general preferences, general scheme of preferences, are all determined under customs legislation, which passed through the Commons, but the Lords have no say in because of the restriction and the Lords interfering with financial matters. So tariffs and related matters don't come to us, and they were passed in a piece of customs legislation in 2018. The trade bill then was about giving the government the powers to implement trade treaties. From the government's point of view, they regarded through the passage of the trade bills that the Cragg scrutiny process, which you've heard about, was sufficient for trade treaty making. And I think during the course of the trade legislation, there was a great deal of quite forceful debate, suggesting that given the relative importance of trade negotiations to our future activity, it was really important that we had additional powers. There was never really a consensus in the Lords, let alone in the Commons, that the legislature should have a capacity to mandate the negotiating objectives of the government. And the reason was pretty straightforward, that there is a large body of opinion that believes that the distinction between the executive and the legislature means that the executive should decide whether to undertake a treaty negotiation, should set the negotiating objectives, and should carry out the negotiation. But at each stage, the legislature should be consulted and informed and have the ability to scrutinise the resulting agreements. And during the course of the trade bill, we really forced those issues to the point where the government have agreed that there should be formal publication of negotiating objectives for trade negotiations, and where the relevant committees, in our case, the International Agreements Committee, and in the Commons, the International Trade Committee, should have the opportunity to make a report to their House and for there to be a debate on that, so that the government is aware of the issues that legislators regard as important. I think we in our committee certainly regard this as one of the central objectives of our work, is that we set out, as Diane was telling you a moment ago, we set out what it is that the government is trying to achieve in their negotiations. Otherwise, a great deal of our subsequent scrutiny of the treaty that's agreed is rather limited. During the course of the trade bill, the other thing is, which Alex will have referred to as was the Grimstone rule. We pressed them very hard on possible legislative changes to Cragg. The government didn't concede any of those, but they did concede in order to secure the passage of the legislation what we now call the Grimstone rule, which essentially is that where the International Agreements Committee, in our case, produce a report on a new free trade agreement and ask for a debate, not just reporting it for information, but report it to the House for debate, the government will try to facilitate that debate subject to parliamentary time being available. I say that as a former leader of the House of Commons. They always have to say that, but I think we can regard that as a pretty fixed commitment. And linked to that, the government does not envisage a free trade agreement proceeding to ratification without a debate first having taken place on that agreement, if one has been requested by our committee or the International Trade Committee in a timely fashion. So there is a link between those debates and the ratification process. Now, one of the central things Alex will have explained is that we are a dualist state. We're not in the same relationship to the executive as the European Parliament was to the European Commission and the Council. We're not in the same relationship to the administration as the Congress and the Senate is in the United States. But what we do have is not only a scrutinizing power in relation to treaties under CRAG, but where they require implementation into domestic law, of course, Parliament has the ability to decide whether something should be translated into legislation. So the relationship between the two things, the legislative process and the ratification process, is quite tricky. And I think we're still finding our way where this is concerned. If the government has signed an agreement internationally, but not yet ratified it, it should then proceed to secure the domestic legislation required for its implementation before ratification. But if that domestic legislation were not to be agreed, let's say we're in a hung parliament and the government couldn't secure some part of that treaty, it would have to go back and seek to renegotiate with its partners. If it ratifies, then I think the government is not in a position to go back to partners and to seek any changes in any agreements that have been reached. So it is really important that we maintain that domestic legislation must be secured before the ratification process is completed. I just want to mention one other final thing, and this is purely a personal view, not a view of the International Agreements Committee as a whole. But I think there is this is part of a much broader issue, which is about the relationship between the executive and the legislature in relation to prerogative powers. The government clings to the idea that all the existing prerogative powers are necessary for the government to undertake its executive functions. And they do so literally on the basis of precedent and history. But the authority that the government deploys when it uses the prerogative power is the authority of Parliament. And if the government has a majority in the House of Commons, its authority can prevail. And it should not really require to circumvent Parliament, as it did with the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. If you remember, even CRAG was disapplied by the government in the legislation implementing the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. We didn't even get that scrutiny. So the government ought to let Parliament have the ability to determine where prerogative powers are used. It arises in relation to treaty making, and I think Parliament should be able to approve treaties rather than simply to scrutinise them. It arose in relation to the dissolution and calling of Parliament Bill, which was passed at the end of the last parliamentary session, where the government recreated the prerogative to dissolve Parliament in its old form, rather than allowing any part of Parliament to be able to determine whether Parliament should be dissolved. And it arises in relation to my private member's bill, which is not unfortunately high enough in the ballot to get debated anytime soon, but relates to war powers, where we are in the position where nobody really knows under what circumstances the government requires parliamentary consent to deploy United Kingdom forces overseas in a substantial way for a long period of time, other than in self-defence. So we're in rather a position where I think the prerogative powers is a broader constitutional issue. And I know some of those who are thinking about constitutional issues recognise that the government holds on to prerogative powers because it is extremely convenient for them to do so. But we should actually be asserting Parliament's authority to a greater extent than we have up to now. Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you very much indeed, Lord Lansley. That was absolutely fascinating. Just before I turn to our final speaker, may I encourage you in the audience to submit questions on Slido and to upvote, that's a new word, those that you particularly would like to see discussed. Otherwise, it's left to Chair's discretion, so you might prefer to take back a bit of control there. Meg, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Catherine. We've heard from three real experts in the treaty field. I've been invited to make some more sort of general comments about how this fits into the framework of government relations with Parliament, which pick up actually very neatly from what Andrew Lansley was just saying, because the first thing I was going to draw attention to a couple of themes. The first one of them was prerogative powers. As Andrew has said and Alex has emphasised, treaty making is a prerogative power, and the trend in recent decades has been towards Parliament sort of nibbling away at these prerogative powers and getting a little bit more control in different areas, some of which Andrew's mentioned. So the war power, also control over the civil service and public appointments, and until recently, as Andrew said, the dissolution of Parliament and the calling of general elections, which of course has recently been reversed and has caused enormous controversy in the last few days regarding a possible early general election. So maybe that wasn't such a good idea to hand that power back to the Prime Minister, but that's a separate topic. In that kind of context, it is perhaps surprising that with respect to treaties, we're still living with a slightly more codified version of a rule that's 98 years old. Notwithstanding the fact that there's been a huge growth in international agreements over those 98 years. And of course, more recently, we've seen the changes with relation to Brexit. The second general trend is in terms of scrutiny across the board. I would say that over recent decades, we've had a general sense of parliamentary scrutiny growing, demonstrated in various ways. So, for example, the development of the select committee system in both chambers, gradually increasingly well-resourced and assertive, including greater interest in legislation by specialist select committees, some of them who are designed for that purpose, others not, and moves to evidence taking by Commons public bill committees. And then, of course, other procedural developments like the Westminster Hall Forum, the growth of urgent questions in the Commons Backbench Business Committee, and alongside that, all of that, and perhaps to some extent because of it, more demonstrable independence of thought, speech, and voting by MPs. So in that general environment, you might well expect mechanisms for the scrutiny of international agreements to have developed more quickly than they have. It's curious that we're only starting this conversation now. And of course, there's also the international context where we look slightly out of step. So the European Parliament has been mentioned with respect to how when it was negotiating effectively on our behalf, it had considerable oversight of negotiating objectives of the negotiations themselves and the ability to decide whether to approve treaties. I read in the Public Law Project evidence to the PACAC inquiry that something like 90% of states around the world actually give their parliaments an approval power over treaties, and we don't have that. So it does raise questions of why we haven't seen more progress in this area. And to sort of contrast with what I've said about improved scrutiny, I would say that in general, movements haven't been universally positive across the board in terms of growth of parliamentary scrutiny, either medium term or particularly more recently. So over the longer term, a key example would be the growing disquiet that we've seen at the growth in the use of delegated legislation, secondary legislation. That's legal changes that ministers can make with little to no parliamentary oversight. We have got new specialist committees in the Lords on that, which do excellent work. But the extent of power delegated and the use of that delegated power has been a growing cause of concern. We saw a lot of controversy about that over COVID. It was also a key feature of the Brexit process, but the Hansard Society had raised the alarm about this years ago, way before Brexit, and it's currently exploring again how we can improve matters in that area. So while Parliament has enhanced its scrutiny capacity and its confidence, at the same time, policy gets more complex and you hit parliamentary resource constraints, and perhaps also government also gets more stubborn. And I think that's a rather similar story to the treaty story, the delegated legislation story. There's also a well-established complaint, which I've drawn particular attention to in my work, of government control of the parliamentary agenda, particularly in the House of Commons. This was hugely controversial over Brexit, again, hugely controversial during COVID lockdowns, but that concern has also been around for a long time. Back in 2009, the Right Committee proposed that MPs should get a vote on the House of Commons weekly agenda and decide their own priorities for what should be debated, but that never happened. And clearly that is very directly a factor with treaties. So MPs can, in theory, object to them, but how do they get a vote? Indeed, how do they even get a debate when the government not only owns most of the agenda, but also controls when non-government time, things like opposition days, are given? There seems to be a bit of recent movement, which Alex referred to in the exchange of letters with respect to this on treaties, but it's pretty limited. Trade treaties only, some caveats which Lord Lansley referred to. Moving to the shorter term, the last few years have been marked by, rather in the opposite direction to what I said at the start, increased government resistance to scrutiny by Parliament. That's definitely a feature of the Johnson regime, but it followed on from Theresa May's government style. Post-2016, disagreements over Brexit and the complexity of Brexit made May's government very closed and resistant to parliamentary scrutiny. And Johnson has continued that in spades. It suits his own personal style, and at least to some extent was necessitated by the pandemic. But well beyond the pandemic, we've seen bills rush through, late government amendments, attempts to create new fast-track procedures, including on Brexit freedoms, and very heavy-handed whipping, which discourages independent backbench thought. All of that is bad for scrutiny. So in that context, it perhaps makes even the small progress that's been achieved over treaties somewhat countercultural. I'll just say two things to close, if I may, about the costs and benefits and possible red herrings. First, I think there's a risk of greater parliamentary control over international affairs being seen as a threat because of the arguments over Brexit, the meaningful votes, the indicative votes, all of that which became very messy and painful. Some people might use that to argue that Parliament poking its nose into international negotiations is a recipe for trouble. But it can't be overstated how atypical the Brexit period was. Not even primarily because of minority government, but because that was an international agreement over which the government itself was deeply divided. Parliament was divided, the public was divided. And I think with respect to most international agreements, it's far more likely that we're either basically all broadly in agreement, or at least that there's agreement on the government's own side. So my final point is that this basically comes down to a question about the value of scrutiny. Some might question when a government has a majority and Parliament maybe doesn't have a veto power, whether scrutiny can even achieve very much. But as a general rule, better scrutiny leads to better policy. Knowing you have to defend yourself in public makes you think things through. So potentially that means having to think through more carefully your negotiating objectives, and later having others help you spot whether there are flaws in what you've agreed. In that light, Parliament and government are actually on the same side. Parliament scrutiny helps the government get its policy right. It's a healthy thing for scrutiny to grow, and government should welcome that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that. That's absolutely fascinating. And thank you for situating the specific discussions in the broader context of scrutiny of executive action more generally. A large number of questions have come in and I'm conscious of time, so I won't ask all of you to comment on all points, but there's been a couple of very specific points addressed to Baroness Hayter, if I may, and I will just address those first before opening it more broadly. one question, Baroness Hayter, is could you update us what the situation is about scrutiny of treaty amendments? And the questioner is asking specifically about, for example, the Northern Ireland Protocol. And another question is about the involvement of overseas territories and Crown dependencies.
The first one's spot on to one of our ongoing questions to the government. One of the things, sorry, in the working practices report that we've said there, and we've said it, I think, on all our comments on everything that's come to us, is that the government should be clear about about who has the authority to make amendments to treaties, and also when they should be brought to us. We suggested, and Alex will know the wording much better than I do, but we suggested some criteria on a number of things to be brought to us. But basically, does it have human rights implications? Does it have expenditure implications? Does it have significant new obligations? Those sort of treaty amendments, it seems to us, should be caught by CRAG and should come to us. Some undoubtedly will do, because effectively they're a new treaty, or it may be written in, but it is very, very unclear at the moment what would have to go to Parliament. Because the TCA was dealt with in a different way, I don't think that would be covered, but Alex will have to help me on that, by the sort of, in other words, it's not been written into the TCA, whether a change to the protocol would count as a new, effectively a new treaty, and therefore have to come to us. But I'll let, if I may, Alex comment on that. On the second issue, on overseas independent territories, they of course cannot themselves make treaties, and basically it's on a treaty by treaty basis. They would be any treaty we sign would be assumed to cover them, unless it was excluded. And so if you look at any of the FTAs that have been signed, they will either say yes, they're covered, or no, they're not, or no, they're not at the moment, but it was been agreed that they can be at such point, and that would be dealt with in the treaty, because they themselves don't have treaty making powers. So they are, if you like, part of anything we sign, unless it specifically says in the treaty that we make with another government that doesn't include them, or doesn't include them at that time. But could I ask Alex just answer about the Northern Ireland Protocol and how that's dealt with?
So the question of amendments is dealt with by CRAG, but in a very uninformative way. There's a sort of slightly circular provision that says that some amendments will be subject to ratification and notification, therefore, to Parliament. But there are no criteria to suggest when that should happen. And the problem that you then have is that lots of treaties will have treaty bodies created under them, which will have the power to amend international agreements with the consent of both the parties. This is the sort of thing that we see, for example, in the withdrawal agreement, in the TCA, and in many other international trade agreements, for example, that minor amendments can be made by consensus by the parties without necessarily having to negotiate a brand new international agreement. And it's our understanding, and certainly the government seem to take that view, that those are not captured by the provisions in CRAG and therefore won't be laid for scrutiny. They will be notified at some point. So the government have undertaken to keep treaty pages up to date with all amendments. But the problem is there seems to be no principled approach whatsoever as to what gets caught by CRAG and what doesn't. It's the same problem you have with the distinction between treaties and MOUs. There's no principled approach as to what has to be in a treaty or what has to be in an MOU, save that treaties are legally binding. And whereas one thought that that was a clear-cut, bright line distinction at one point, things like the MOU with Rwanda show that you can do quite a lot of things with an MOU that have legal effects, even if they're not quote-unquote binding in international law as a treaty must be. So there's a lot left out of CRAG, and unfortunately with the agreements with the EU, the same is true. I mean, we do seem to get some reporting going on now about what's being discussed about amendments, but it will all fall within the same issue around what's caught by CRAG and what isn't.
Thank you, that's very helpful. There's now a series of questions about the devolveds. And I wonder perhaps, Lord Lansley, whether you'd like to make a start on tackling those. The first question is, how could the devolves have a greater role in treaty scrutiny within the current constitutional setup? And then there's another question from Gethin Rees, who says the Welsh Government is recommending that the Senedd does not consent to the New Zealand-Australia bill, whilst the constitutional implications of UK ratifying treaties rejected by devolved parliaments. I realise that's a bit of a googly to bowl you, Lord Lansley, but I don't know if you want to have a tackle at that. I don't know if I've lost you again. In which case I'll come back to the...
Yeah,
oh,
don't worry.
okay, thank you.
Sorry about that, yeah.
Go ahead.
Yes, no, I did hear that. And I think the starting point, of course, you have to remember the dualist nature of our proceedings, that while the treaty-making power is a reserved power and trade relations is a reserved power, and the government is very focused on that fact, that constitutional fact, the implementation of treaties very often impinges directly upon powers that are devolved and issues that are devolved. So from our point of view as the International Agreements Committee, we've been very focused on the importance of the negotiating objectives being themselves something that are agreed with the devolved administrations, so that the subsequent process of implementation of an agreement is in line with the anticipation and legislative intentions of the various administrations. Now that I think our common refrain, I think Diane will, I hope, agree with this, our common refrain is that the government may have consulted at official level to a substantial extent with administrations, but we are unclear as to the extent to which those administrations, when they offer views on treaty objectives and indeed treaty texts, the government takes them on board. And the memoranda, the explanatory memoranda that come to us generally are much more informative about the fact of a process of consultation than they are about the content of the representations that are being made. And what we would like to see is much greater clarity about where the devolved administrations have sought certain results in treaty negotiations and where the government have succeeded in that or not done so, and what they do about that. We do, of course, have the benefit of representations to us from the devolved legislatures and administrations. And I think in that context, for example, the Welsh, I think we found the Welsh administration's representations particularly substantial and helpful in examining the Australia deal recently. When it comes to the question of the second question was really about the implementation, wasn't it?
It was more how can they have a greater role in the scrutiny process, and and also more generally, I think what happens?
Role, it is going to be very difficult for their role to really extend beyond the question of where they have legislative competence. And the difficulty for the government is if they enter into a treaty agreement, the effect of which requires changes in legislation, and they don't secure the legislative consent from the administrations, what do they then do about it? I don't think we've arrived at that position, but I think there is a considerable potential for conflict between them. I mean, strictly speaking, this is an area I didn't get involved in, the common framework between the administrations, which should enable them to arrive at a point where anything that comes up in treaty negotiations should be part of a common framework between the administrations. But that depends upon the common framework being agreed. and there is considerable conflict about the common frameworks between the administrations. So we haven't arrived at that constitutional impasse yet. But if thinking purely hypothetically, so a devolved administration were to refuse to legislate in a way consistent with an international treaty, one has to beg the question, would the government say that they have the ability to override the devolved powers in order to implement what has been agreed in a treaty that the UK Parliament has ratified?
Thank you. That's immensely helpful. And of course, it raises issues of the Vienna Convention on the law of the treaties as well, which
we have to, yes, if we enter into a treaty and we ratify it, there is an expectation legitimately on the part of our international partners that we can deliver it.
And
it's probably also, isn't it? Probably also worth just chipping in that there's nothing unique about this situation. These sort of devolved territorial tensions exist beyond the treaty field, and particularly post-Brexit, there's a lot of sorting out that we need to do across that area in general.
Yeah.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to come in on that point before I move on to the next question? In which case, the next question again is largely a process question. It might, given your background, Andrew Lansley, it might be the one for you, which is how do you see the Commons having greater involvement in treaty scrutiny?
Yeah, well, of course, as a former leader of the House of Commons, I'm quite interested in how that works. I think we have to be aware of the distinctive roles of the Commons and the Lords. So the International Trade Committee in the Commons does sometimes undertake inquiries that, on the face of it, substantially overlap with our own. But there is also considerable complementary work. So, for example, on tariff schedules, on tariffs, on the work of the Trade Remedies Authority, what is the government's trade strategy, how to implement trade treaties, how to secure export performance and the like. That is all part of the role of the International Trade Committee in, as it were, shadowing and scrutinising the work of the Department for International Trade. One might expect that they would, as part of that, not look in detail at every trade treaty that comes through. And I think it would probably not, they would not expect to do that. We wouldn't expect them to. I think we and the Commons should both be engaged fully in trying to assess the negotiating objectives and enabling informed debate in both houses on the negotiating objectives. But I think in large measure it falls to us to do the detailed work of examining the treaties that are laid before Parliament and ensuring that we have identified all of the issues that arise from them. And I don't actually anticipate the Commons doing that detailed work. So it is a bit like the distinction between the Commons and the Lords in relation to the scrutiny of secondary legislation, where we do the legwork, they do the broad brush approaches to it. But they have a broader brush than ours, and we fill in some of the detail. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable division of labour. The tricky part, of course, is under Cragg, insofar as there is any real sanction, it is the ability to delay ratification on the part of the Commons, which is not a power available to the Lords. So I think we in the International Trade Committee do need to keep closely working together on trade treaties to identify where there is an emerging serious issue that it would be appropriate for the International Trade Committee and ourselves to report to both houses for debate, not least if there was ever a possibility of a motion seeking to defer ratification in the Commons. On treaties more generally, there is I won't go on about it, but as Diane was, I think, setting out very capably, there is a broader issue. So, for example, on the MOU with Rwanda, we are an International Agreements Committee. We have instituted an inquiry into it. We've done that not under Cragg, because under Cragg, it isn't laid under Cragg because it is not, in its own terms, binding under international law. One of the articles says that it is not. But we don't think we are constrained by that. We are not a Cragg scrutiny committee. We are an international agreements committee. So we are looking into it. Whether and where somebody in the Commons is going to look into it, I really don't know. But I think it is our job to do that. So we do have a broader role in developing the scrutiny of treaties, principally with the FCDO, but in other departments, which I don't think has ever really happened in the past by any part of the legislature.
Thank you very much. Alex.
If I could, just a couple of brief points on that. I think you acknowledged at the beginning that the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee is conducting an inquiry in the Commons on this, and I think that's one to keep a ready eye on. In my own submission to that inquiry, I made a couple of points. One which I'd reference here, which is the Commons does have the subject-specific committees, and I think there's a sort of urgent need to tie that into the process somehow, so that they don't duplicate the efforts of the International Agreements Committee and the Lords, but that they do pick up on the relevant international agreements that relate to their subjects and take a view that they exercise some degree of control in the Commons on what the government is doing with those. And that leads me briefly to the second point, which is I think everyone that has looked at this seriously thinks that you won't obtain great change in this without giving the UK Parliament a consent mechanism. And I suspect, looking at the structure of CRAG, that consent mechanism would have to operate in the Commons. So any vote would be in the Commons. And so in those circumstances, I think there would need to be some sort of working group in Parliament which made clear, where the International Agreements Committee had drawn something to the special attention of the House, that was somehow then integrated into the Commons' own processes, so that they were aware of that at an early opportunity and had the time to essentially arrange for debates and votes where necessary. But that's obviously very much more forward-looking. But in process terms, you would have to make that work.
Thank you, Alex. There's been some more general questions, and perhaps Meg would like to kick off on this one about, from Arabella Lang, how would you suggest the government could be encouraged to see treaty scrutiny as being in its own interest rather than a threat? And perhaps relatedly, or reasonably relatedly, often one of the questions is that objectives are being published, but usually on the same day as negotiations formally start. It doesn't allow any time or any process to react or shape them. So how can the parliamentary process be improved so that there can be better scrutiny, and how can government be persuaded that scrutiny is good?
I think those are really tricky questions. I mean, there's very much a culture inside government that, you know, when I worked inside government briefly, and I was quite surprised as a parliamentary specialist, the extent to which this doesn't come from ministers. Very often it comes from civil servants, a kind of natural aversion to Parliament meddling in their affairs. And so that's quite a difficult battle. I think ministers are much more open to this on the whole than civil servants are, so working through ministers and persuading them. And I mean, sometimes maybe something's got to go wrong before people realise that it would have been better if they'd had better scrutiny in the first place. So as I said, you know, the whole point of scrutiny, even if you don't have, the consent mechanism is clearly important. But even just having a debate where awkward questions get asked causes ministers to ask civil servants awkward questions and to satisfy themselves that the government's policy is defensible. And that can have a really powerful effect. What was the second question? It was more,
how do you give enough time for there to be scrutiny within the system so that the negotiating objectives aren't laid that day and the negotiations start the same day?
Yes, well, I was very interested by what Diane said about that example of the US. I mean, obviously treaties are extremely broad. I was thinking that when Lord Lansley was speaking about the International Trade Committee in the Commons, of course, we're talking about treaties that go beyond trade. So as Alex said, other select committees are relevant as well on other treaties. But when Diane said that seeking a sort of broad set of objectives that goes beyond any individual negotiation, and having discussions about that, about what at heart, it is that the government is trying to achieve with its international agreements, which is too big a question in itself, but with respect to trade, with respect to the environment, with respect to human rights, I don't know, in some broad areas, that would enable you to kind of get ahead of the individual negotiations, I guess. I thought that was very interesting. I don't know if Diane knows more about how it works in the States.
I was just actually, I'm conscious that we're very near the end of time. And I just, the last question I want to just put to you, and it's essentially you've got a 1 or 2 word answer, is if you could teleport a system that does good treaty scrutiny, which country, which system would you teleport from? Diane, do you want to start?
Well, New Zealand for one, you know, they have it right. But I will take my 1 minute to just comment on where Meg left that, because I was in the States recently meeting the trade people, and in a sense everything is up in the air at the moment because of Ukraine. There is now much more awareness of our the vulnerability of supply chains, not just of our food security, but of others. And it seems to me more important than ever now that we do have a policy framework that makes sure that we are saying to government that it signs up to trade agreements that actually have a long-term and wider responsibility for the future of the country, including trade, but not exclusively that. And certainly with Biden and Ambassador Tai at the moment, we will see that if the Democrats lose the House, things may change a lot, and things might change again there with a change of president. But certainly, I mean, as Andrew says, it is different. It's not the same system as ours. Trade is actually a responsibility of Congress, but it then gives it to the executive to do, and then can take it back at any time. So, you know, Andrew's quite right. We can't adopt the same system, but it does seem to me we can both listen to them, but we also ought to be discussing with the legislators in these other countries how we make this right on a global basis and not simply on a British one. That goes well beyond my committee's remit. That's a private view.
Thank you. Lord Lansley.
Yeah, I just want to add 2 quick things. First, you did ask about earlier, somebody was asking about the overseas territories and crown dependencies and so on. I would just highlight that one of our predecessor committees on which I served, the Internal Market Committee, we did work quite hard at bringing representations from Gibraltar, Jersey, Guernsey and so on, including oral evidence to those committees. So we can be a very effective place for the administrations in those territories and dependencies to say their bit publicly about what their view is on treaties and agreements. On the point, Diane is quite right. You know, we just it's the Westminster model that we have to look to, and we have drawn quite a lot on Australia, New Zealand, Canada to see how we go about our treaty development. But I would just say my feeling is that we have reached considerable accommodations with the Department for International Trade on trade treaties, and we need to keep that going. But I think we have a lot of territory yet to gain in terms of the scrutiny of treaties outside the trade context. And the evidence is that the government is continuing to resist this. They have never in the past felt that they were scrutinised on treaties in Parliament, and they don't like it. And I think it's very important that we develop this as an activity that we do thoroughly, not only in the trade context but more broadly. Thank you.
Alex, where would you like to be teleported from?
Okay, so very, very briefly, I think in terms of an ideal system, or maybe not ideal, but a good system, what the European Parliament was doing was decent. And I think the reason they got the information about all of these agreements was because of the consent requirement. But I do agree with Andrew Lansley that probably we need to look at a Westminster system. So here's a curveball for you, Fiji. You look at Fiji, they have a model constitution. they have a consent mechanism. It's a Westminster-style system, and the standing orders of their Foreign Affairs Committee allow for the scrutiny of treaties. You can cut and paste the whole thing, bung it in the Commons, and there you go. And you don't need to do very much work.
I think we all need to do a mission there to go and have a check. And Meg.
Well, I think this is a handy get-out clause because I am no expert on how these things work in other places. But as a comparativist as well as a British politics scholar, I would say teleportation is rarely wise as much as it isn't possible. Cherry picking is generally quite a good principle. And I think that this is a very multifaceted area, isn't it? We're talking about how to run committees, some of the challenges that Diane mentioned, about sort of sifting, dealing with evidence gathering and the kind of information overwhelm, how you sift, what the criteria are, what kinds of debates you have, etc. I suspect there are different things that can be learnt from different places, and that building up relationships between Diane and Andrew's committee and their opposite numbers in places in various parts of the world would probably have a lot of benefit.
Thank you. Thank you all enormously for your contribution today. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you to all of the audience for your many and varied questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all, but I hope we've covered a good range of the topics that have been raised by you all. Thank you to UK and Changing Europe for organising this, and may I wish you a very good afternoon. Thank you very much indeed.